Let's go back to two logical operators that we already used before, but we didn't use their full potential yet. And I'm talking about the AND operator and the OR operator, and how we can use them for something called short circuiting. So up until this point, we have used logical operators only to combine Boolean values. But the truth is that we can do a lot more with the AND and OR operators. So let's start with the OR operator here. And so let me log 3 or Jonas. So that's something that we didn't do before, which is to use basically non-Boolean values here as the operands. Okay? So let's see what the result of this is going to be. And for some reason I have to reload here. And you see that the result is 3. And so that means that the result of the OR operator doesn't always have to be a Boolean. And so that's something that I didn't show you before. So there are 3 properties that I didn't tell you before about logical operators. So first, they can use any data type. They can return any data type, and they do something called short circuiting, or as we also call it, short circuit evaluation. So in fact, here we used 2 values that are not Booleans, okay, and it then returned a value that was not a Boolean. And now about short circuiting. In the case of the OR operator, short circuiting means that if the first value is a truthy value, it will immediately return that first value. So that's exactly what we see here with the 3, which is a truthy value. So again, if the first operand is truthy here in the OR operator, then the other operand will not even be evaluated. So JavaScript will not even take a look at it. And so that's what we mean with short circuiting. And now let's do some more. Let's use the empty string or Jonas now. Then let's say true or 0. And then let's say undefined or null. And now, before taking a look at the result, try to take a guess of what the result of these 3 operations here will be. So did you do that? So let's see. So the first result of this one here is Jonas. And so that's because this here is a falsy value. And so then the second operand will actually also be evaluated, and that's Jonas, and it will then be returned. And so here we see again that the result of the OR operator doesn't have to be a Boolean. It will simply return the truthy value here. Next up, we have true or 0. And so this first value here is truthy, and in fact, it's even true, and so therefore that will simply be the result of the operator. And so that's what we see here. And then here we have undefined or null, and as you already know, undefined is a falsy value, and so we then go to the second operand, so there is no short circuiting, and so that's then the one that's going to be returned. So here we see null, and that happens even though null is also a falsy value. And let's actually now generalize this to more operators, so I can give you basically the general rule of how this operator works, no matter with how many values. So let's say undefined or 0 or empty string or hello or 23 or null. So what do you think that the result of this one will be? And it is hello. And that's essentially because hello here is the first truthy value in this chain of OR operations. So we start with this one. So undefined is falsy. And so then we go to the next one, which is also falsy. And so then to the next one, which is also falsy. And then we get hello. And hello is truthy. And so therefore it will short circuit the entire evaluation. and it will be the returned value. Okay? And if we think about this, then it actually makes sense. Because remember, in the OR operation, the result is true if at least one operand is true, right? So if the first operand is already true, for example, as it happens here, then JavaScript doesn't even have to look at the other values, because the result of the expression will already be true anyway. And so it will short circuit and then simply return that first result. And now let's see a more practical application of this. So let's say that there might be a property on the restaurant object with the number of guests. So something like this, restaurant.num guests. But again, we don't know if it exists. However, we want to basically define a variable based on this number of guests, and we want to set a default value if this doesn't exist. So basically, what we want to do is this. So guests, I'm going to call it 1 here. And so what we want to do is this. We want to check if it exists, and then the result should be actually restaurant.numGuests. But if it doesn't exist, then we want to set a default value of 10. So let's log guests1 to the console. And so you see that now it is 10. And so that's because restaurant.numGuests doesn't exist. So this is undefined. And so therefore 10 will be the result of this ternary operator. Okay, but now if we do set the property like this, for example, to 23, then guests1 is going to be 23. So, but instead of doing this, we can take advantage of short-circuiting and the OR operator. So let's again write restaurant.numGuests and then simply OR 10. So let's analyze why this works. And first actually store this into a variable. So guests2 equals this, and then console log guests2. So let's take a look at why this works, and starting again with disabling this. And so right now, restaurant.numberOfGuests is undefined. So it's a falsy value, and as we already know, then the second value here will be the result of the OR operator. And so that's basically our default value of 10. So let's take a look, and indeed we get 10 here. But now if we put it back on, then restaurant.numberOfGuests is now 23, which is a truthy value, and therefore the OR operator short circuits and it will become the return value, or let's say the result of the operation. And so now indeed we get 23. And so this is a way easier method of setting default values than having to deal with this ternary operator, or even worse, an if-else statement. Okay? So that is short-circuiting with the AND operator, but we can also do the same with the OR operator, but the AND operator also has short-circuiting. So let's take a look. And we'll start by log something to the console here, like a string to separate, so that we don't get confused by the results in the console then. Oh, but before we talk about the AND operator here, there's actually one more thing that I need to tell you here, which is that both of these solutions here, this and this, will not work when the number of guests is 0. So let's see what happens. And so now they're both 10. And that's not the result that we want, but given what we already know, it makes sense. Because this is now 0, so it's a falsy value, and therefore the second one here will be the result of the operation, and therefore assigned to guests 2. However, 0 is the real number of guests, and so that's the value that we actually would guests 2 to have. But instead, it set the default value of 10. So that's obviously not what we want, and we will explore a great solution to this problem actually in the next lecture. But now, let's talk about the AND operator. And basically, when it comes to short-circuit evaluation, the AND operator works in the exact opposite way of the OR operator. So let's see, 0 and Jonas, and now the result of this is 0. And so what this means is that the AND operator short circuits when the first value is falsy, and then immediately returns that falsy value without even evaluating the second operand. So again, that's exactly the opposite of what happens with the OR operator, which short circuits when the first operator is true. So let's now set it to a true value here, or actually a truthy value, and then in this case, Jonas is actually returned. So when it is truthy, it means that the evaluation continues, and then simply the last value is returned. And once again, this makes sense if we think about it. So the AND operator is only true if all the operands are true. And so if the first one here is false, then it means that the entire result of the AND operation will already be false anyway. And so there's no need to even look at any of the other operands. So I think that's a good way to memorize how both of them work. Anyway, let's again generalize this to multiple operands here. And 23, and null, and Jonas. And so what do you think this time the result will be? Well, let's see. And it is indeed null. And to understand why, let's apply the same logic as before. So this is a truthy value, and therefore the evaluation continues. 23 is also truthy, but then null is a falsy value, and therefore the evaluation no longer needs to continue, because at this point the whole result of the AND operation is going to be false anyway. And then as a result, this is then simply the value that's going to be returned, and it short circuits the rest of the evaluation. So it will not even take a look at Jonas here. All right, and so now let's see another practical example. So let's say if restaurant.order pizza, so basically we're checking if this method exists, and then if it does exist, we want to call it. So restaurant.order pizza, let's say with mushrooms and spinach. So many times we can use the AND operator to actually avoid an if statement like this one, where all we want to do is to check if a certain property or value actually exists. Okay, so in this case here, what we're doing is to basically pretending that we don't know if order pizza exists. And so we first check if it exists, and only then we execute it. And so this now gives us mushrooms and spinach, but with the knowledge that we gained about the AND operator, we can do this in a simpler way. So we can say restaurant.order pizza and then basically if restaurant.order pizza does not exist, so it's undefined, it will then short circuit the evaluation and nothing else will happen. And so that's essentially exactly the same as this if block here is doing. All right, but if it does exist, so if it's a truthy value, then the second part here will be evaluated. And so here in this second operand, we can then call the function. Okay, and it's perfectly fine to use this operand, this second operand here, to call a function. We can put anything here. It doesn't just have to be a single value. Now, I'm not saying that you should go ahead and replace all your if statements with the AND or the OR operators. So please definitely don't do that, because it's going to make your code very hard to read in the future. But anyway, let's now summarize. So the OR operator will return the first truthy value of all the operands, or simply the last value if all of them are falsy. So that's what happened here, right? On the other hand, the AND operator will return the first falsy value or the last value if all of them are truthy. And as for practical applications, we can use the OR operator to set default values, and we can use the AND operator to execute code in the second operand if the first one is true. So play around some more with this maybe, and then let's just move on to the next video where we will solve this problem that we had here with this OR operator and this 0. Let's now learn about the new operator with the funny name of nullish coalescing operator. So in the last video, we used the OR operator to set a default value in case that the first value was a falsy value. So let me bring back that code here actually. So this one, but we're only interested in the OR operator here. So let's call this one simply guessed. And so let's again remember what happens here, which is when we set numGuests to 0, then JavaScript will still take this default value here and assign it to guests, because 0 is a falsy value now, and so therefore we go to the second operand. However, fortunately for us, there is a very good solution to this. And that's the new operator with the very weird name of nullish coalescing operator. It's an operator that was introduced in ES 2020, and it works like this. So guests, let's call this one correct now. And so it works almost the same way as the OR operator. Really almost the same, but it will fix our error here. So let's see that it does, and then I will explain you why that is. All right, and now indeed we get 0. So we get the real value that is actually here. And now if we take it off, only then we get 10, which is the default value that we want. So why does this work? Well, it is because the nullish coalescing operator works with the idea or with the concept of nullish values instead of falsy values. And nullish values are null and undefined. That's it. It does not include a 0 or the empty string. So basically, for the nullish coalescing operator, it is as if the 0 and the empty string were not falsy values and were instead truthy values as well. But again, this operator does work with the principle of nullish values. And so only nullish values will short-circuit the evaluation here. Okay, so only if this was null or undefined, only then the second operand here would be executed and returned. And so right now that's the case, as number of guests does not exist. So we commented it out here. And so now it is undefined. And so only then the evaluation continues. But again, as we put it back, it now is 0. And 0 is not a nullish value. And therefore the evaluation here is short-circuited, and immediately this first non-nullish value is returned. All right, and that's actually all for now about this nullish coalescing operator. It's a really great and really useful operator, even though right now it might not seem that useful. But as we go through the project, you will see that it really is. Now, even more modern than the nullish coalescing operator that we just talked about are 3 new so-called logical assignment operators that were introduced in ES 2021. So let's see how they work. And in order to do that in an effective way, let's quickly start by creating 2 new restaurant objects. So I'm going to call them restaurant 1 and restaurant 2, and they are extremely simple. They just have a name, And then this one has a property, number of guests. And let's set it to 20 here. And then there will also be a restaurant too. And in fact, let's just duplicate this one here. Restaurant 2. Call this one La Piazza. And this one actually doesn't have the number of guests property, but it has an owner. So Giovanni Rossi or whatever. Okay, and the first thing that we want to do now is to set a default number of guests for all the restaurant objects that do not have that property. So in this case, it is just this restaurant here, but let's pretend that we got them, so that we got these restaurants from some kind of API, and now we want to apply something to all of them. So in this case, basically adding the number of guests property to the objects that do not have them. And let's start by using the tool that we already know about to do this. And so that is the OR operator. So we already know how we can do this using the OR operator, right? So let's say rest2 dot number of guests should be equal to rest1 dot num guests or 10. So let's quickly remember that this works because of short circuiting. So in the OR operator, if the first value is truthy, so this one here, then that first value will immediately be returned and the second value will not even be evaluated. So that's this one here. And so by doing this, and here actually should be num guests. So again, by doing this, here we are returning the number of guests if it does exist, so if it's not falsy, and otherwise the 10 is going to be returned. Okay, and in fact, let's duplicate this line here. But first I should fix it, because of course the number of guests in restaurant 2 should be set based on the number of guests that are in restaurant 2 or not. But anyway, I'm duplicating this now and then doing it for both restaurants here so that we can see the result here for both objects. So let's see. And here we go. So the second one here didn't have a number of guests, and so now num guests is 10. And again, that is because of short circuiting. So this here returned undefined, and so then the second one got returned. While here, in this one, this value was 20, and so it is this 20 that immediately got returned. So nothing new up until this point, but now let me introduce the very first logical assignment operator, which is the OR assignment operator. So with that operator, we will be able to write the same thing basically in a more concise way. So rest1.numGuests. And now instead of repeating the same thing again, like I did here, I can simply write OR equal, and then 10. And that's it. So this here is exactly the same as this one, but in a more concise way. Okay. Let's do the same for restaurant 2. And if we comment out these two now, then as you see, the result is exactly the same. Great. So let's write here the OR assignment operator. And basically this operator assigns a value to a variable if that variable is currently falsy. So again, exactly what's happening here. Because this variable is currently falsy, and so it will be assigned the value of 10. Great. So that works beautifully, except in one situation that actually we already encountered before in the previous lecture. So let's actually duplicate this here, comment out this one, and now setting the number of guests to 0, which is a perfectly reasonable number, right? But look what happens if I then run this code again. As we can see here, it is back to being 10, even though we set it to 0 here. So can you guess why that is happening based on what we learned in the last lecture? Well, 0 is actually a falsy value. And so this OR assignment operator is actually working just fine. So this here right now is falsy, and so therefore it will then be assigned this value of 10, which is exactly what this operator does. So again, the logical OR assignment operator will assign a value to a variable if that exact variable is falsy right now. However, fortunately, we have a good way of solving this. So let's copy all of this, put it here, comment out these two because they don't really work. And so here we actually do also have the logical nullish assignment operator. Sounds a bit complicated, but really all it is to change the OR for the nullish coalescing operator. So let's actually write that also here. Nullish assignment operator. So if I save it now, then it is back to 0 here. And that is exactly the correct result here. Let's just remember here that nullish basically means null or undefined. And right here in restaurant 2, the number of guests is undefined. And so therefore, then the 10 will be assigned to that variable. And so in a nutshell, the nullish assignment operator will assign a value to a variable if that exact variable is currently nullish. So again, that is the case in restaurant number 2. Okay, and as you can probably guess, we do also have the logical AND assignment operator. And to learn about that one, let's say that we want to anonymize the names of the restaurant owners. So when there currently is an owner, like here in this object, we want to basically replace this string here with the string anonymous. So how could we do that? Again, using the tools that we already know. Well, let's say rest2.owner, and now let's use for now just an AND operator. So we can say rest2.owner, and then let's write it like this, anonymous. Okay, let's see for now if this worked, and indeed it did. So it replaced the string that we had here before with this anonymous. And so let's remember why this works. Well, once again, it is because of short circuiting. And in the particular case of the AND operator, it short circuits when the first value is falsy, and then immediately returns that falsy value. So in this case, that's not what's happening. So this is truthy right now, and so therefore the second value will then actually be evaluated and returned. So if we duplicated this, like this, then you see that it's now actually being set to undefined because, well, the restaurant1.owner does not exist. So that property is not here, and so this value is undefined. And since the AND operator short circuits when the first value is falsy, well, then that is the value that is immediately returned. So again, we already learned about that a little bit earlier in the section, and so that's why I'm not going really deep into the details here once again. What I will go into detail is that we can now replace, once again, this duplicate variable here. So basically replacing it with the AND assignment operator. So for doing that, I can write rest1 and AND equal, and then here let's just copy this string. All right, and copying it for restaurant2. And I can then comment these two out, and just for the sake of completeness, let's also write it here. Oh, and we get an error here, and that's of course because I forgot the number of guests. And actually it is .owner, of course. So .owner, Let's see. And there we go. So the owner has been replaced with anonymous in this case. And here in the case of the first restaurant, the result is even better now than what we had before, because with this code here, we actually had the owner then set to undefined, which was not really what we wanted. Now it is simply not here. And so basically what the logical AND assignment operator does is to assign a value to a variable if it is currently truthy. All right. So clearly this here was falsy because it didn't exist, and so then nothing happened. So the object stayed exactly the same. Then here, this here was indeed truthy. So it was Giovanni before, and so it was replaced now with this other string. And so again, if you ever need to assign a value to a variable that is already defined, so that has a value that is currently truthy, then you can use this AND assignment operator. It's now time for a break from learning so that we can now actually apply everything we learned in this section so far to our first coding challenge. And in this one, we're going to start building a football betting application. And for my American friends, that is called soccer. So let's say that we get some data about a particular football game from a web service. And so this is what that data will look like. So an object with this information about the game, so the date, who scored, the score, an array of 2 arrays with all the players. And you can get this data for yourself either from the challenge PDF file that is at the beginning of the course, or from the final code of this section that is available in the GitHub code repository that you downloaded for this course. Okay, so in this challenge, we are going to work with that data. And so here are your 7 tasks. And trust me, most of them take only 1 minute to complete. Anyway, create one player array for each of the teams and call them players 1 and players 2. In each of the arrays, we assume that the first player in the array is the goalkeeper and the other 10 players are the field players. So for team number 1, which is Bayern Munich, create a variable called GK for the goalkeeper and then an array called field players with all the remaining 10 players. Next up, create an array called all players, which is going to contain all the players of both of the teams. Okay, next up, it says that Bayern Munich used 3 substitute players. So that's team 1. And so I want you to create a new array, this one here, containing all the original players, plus Thiago, Coutinho, and Perisic. Next up, take the game.odds object and then create one variable for each of the odds and call them team 1, draw, and team 2. All right, next up, write this function print goals, which should receive an arbitrary number of player names, and so not an array, and then the function prints each of the players to the console and also a string with the number of goals that were scored in total. So that were scored, let's say here, in total. So for example here, it would be 4 goals because we have 4 players. Okay, so for this number 6, use the players Davis, Müller, Lewandowski, and Kimmich. Okay, so first call the function with these 4, and then after that also call the function with the players that are in game.scored. Okay, and so that's the players here that I just showed you, these 4. Finally, we assume that the team with the lower odd is more likely to win. And so now your task is to print to the console which team is actually more likely to win, but without using an if-else statement or the ternary operator. So this might seem like a lot of work, but it's really not that hard, I believe. So please try to do at least some of them, and even if you're not able to maybe finish one of these last 2, it's as always good that you try at least. So take 15 minutes or half an hour, and then I see you back here. All right, hopefully you managed to finish some of these tasks, or even better, all of them. And so now let me show you my solution here. So first off, creating the two player 1 and 2 arrays. And so we will do that using destructuring, and we're going to destructure this players array. Okay, so this is one big array which contains two arrays in there. And so we can create one variable for each of these by simply destructuring the original array. So players 1 and players 2 is the result of destructuring game.players. Okay, let's take a look. Players 1 and players 2. And indeed, these are exactly the two arrays that before were together in game.players. And now they are these two separate arrays. Okay, next up, we should create one variable goalkeeper and then one array with all the remaining players. And whenever you hear remaining, you can think of the rest syntax, right? And so again, we will use destructuring, and we will do it based on the players 1 array. So the team of Bayern Munich. And so from there, we take the first value and store it into the goalkeeper variable. And then the next variable should be called, remember, field players. And it should contain all the remaining values that haven't been taken from the array yet. And so we do that using the rest syntax. So let's check again, goalkeeper and field players. And indeed, that worked beautifully. Next up, our task is to create one array with all the players. So all players. And so simple enough, we can use the spread operator to extend both of the player arrays. So players 1, and so that's the first 11 players. And then we also put all the other 11 players of Borussia Dortmund here as well. Okay. And indeed, we get one single array with 22 elements, so with all of the players in there. So I see that with this, you're starting to see how useful these very simple to use operators are, and that without them, we would have so much more work to do. Anyway, in this exercise, we're going to create a new array, which will contain players 1 plus 3 other players. So that's players 1 final. And so let's just do what I just said. So we take all the players of players 1. So we are unpacking that array basically into this new array. And then we add the 3 new ones. Thiago, Coutinho, and Perisic. And this one, we don't even need to take a look at the console. We can be sure that it's correct. Next up, we want to create 3 variables based on this odds object here. So team 1, then this one here should be called draw, and then team 2. Okay, and so let's actually do nested destructuring here. And so basically do it like this. So we're going to destruct just the game variable. So to make it a little bit more even of a challenge. So we could do a game.odds here already, but let's just do it like this. So we take game, and from there we take the odds property. And so if we did just this, then this would now create one variable called odds with the entire object in there. But that's not what we want. And so we can further destructure this result. And so remember, we used the colon here again. And to me, this is maybe the most confusing part of this structuring. But, well, that's just how it works. All right. And so now basically we are inside of the odds object. And so now we can just take team 1, X, and team 2 out. So team 1 X and team 2. But now remember that instead of X, we actually wanted to call it draw. And so we use again a colon and then give it the variable name that we want. So that's just like we did it before with the restaurant, but of course applied to another context. Draw and team 1 or team 2, just to make sure. And indeed, these are exactly the 3 values that we have up there. Next up, number 6. So this is going really well. So let's create our print goals function now, like this, which remember should take in an arbitrary amount of players. And what we mean by that is this. So let me start by calling the function here to make that more clear. So in the test data, it says to use Davis, Miller, Lewandowski, and Kimmich. So just like this. But then, of course, it's supposed to work just the same with another number of players. For example, just these 2. All right. And so the way we specify that here in our code is to use the rest parameters. Remember that? So this will then basically aggregate all the incoming arguments into one array. And now let's start by logging here how many goals were scored. And so that is, of course, the length of the incoming players array. So players.length goals were scored. And so, indeed, this first call here gives us 4 goals were scored because we have 4 arguments, and then 2 goals were scored. All right. And then after these examples, the instruction tells us to use actually these values. So this game.scored array. Okay. Now we cannot just do this, right? I mean, we can, but it's not going to give us the result we are expecting. So instead we get 1 goals were scored. And so that's because we only passed in 1 argument. Let's take a look actually at the players to see what I mean. And so the problem here in this last function call, let's take out these 2. So the problem is that now we get 1 array, and in that array is this array with the 4 elements, right? And so instead, we really need these arguments here 1 by 1. Right? So we need to take the players out of the array. And I hope that you can see where this is leading. And so we use the spread operator to do just that. And now we are correct. Great. Now we were also supposed to print all the players 1 by 1 to the console, but I'm not going to waste time with that now. We already did that so many times before. Finally, let's now print to the console which team is more likely to win based on the odds variables. So basically these variables that we created here before, team 1 and team 2, which contain these odds. So remember that the team with the lower odd is more likely to win. And so we should now print that to the console without an if statement or the ternary operator. So you can probably guess that we should use a logical operator for that, right? So what we need to test for first is to check if team 1 is less than team 2. And in this condition, team 1 is more likely to win, right? So let's already print that to the console, and then we choose the logical operator, which allows us to reach the goal here. So team 1 is more likely to win. So basically, we want this here to be evaluated when the result of this operation is true. And which is the logical operator that continues operation when the first value is true? Well, it's the AND operator, right? So the OR operator short circuits when the first value is true. And so that's not what we want. So because then right now it would short circuit and this would not be evaluated. But in this case, when this is true, we actually want the evaluation to continue. And therefore, this is the way to go. And so, yeah, team 1 is more likely to win. Now, if the odds were the other way around, let's say here we had 11, then nothing would happen. And so now we also need to do this here another time and do the opposite, basically. So now if team 2 has less than team 1, then team 2 is more likely to win. And so now we get that corresponding result there. Let's put it back. Okay. And challenge completed. So I hope all of this made sense and that it was a great way of reviewing everything that we had done so far.